Welcome to the Hello Flow podcast, a space where we bridge together professional success and career alignment with personal well-being. I'm your host, Casey Cunliffe. Join me in conversations around driving your career while also being mindful of your overall well-being. At a time when many people are awakening to their soul's purpose and navigating that messy but magical middle, I offer this space for personal and professional growth and alignment, and a place to ground and support you in your daily grind. After tuning into this podcast, I hope you receive the empowering counsel and actionable tools to usher in more ease and flow in your life, and equip you as you discover, develop, and evolve your Dharma. Now on to the episode. I am so excited to introduce this week's guest, my friend, Dr. Daya Grant. Daya is a neuroscientist, certified mental performance consultant, and yoga meditation teacher who specializes in helping elite athletes and high performers train their mind for peak performance. Daya has a master's degree in Kinesiology, sports psychology, and a doctorate in Neuroscience from UCLA. She takes her academic research background and combines it with her lifelong experience with meditation that her parents introduced to her and her younger brother at a very young age. I am so fascinated with Daya's approach, combining Western medicine with Eastern and ancient philosophies. We talk about how modern-day science backs up the centuries-old ancient systems that we are still uncovering and understanding how these systems work in our bodies and minds, and how and why they are so effective. We talk about how the brain works, what tools we can use to strengthen the efficiency of the brain, how those impact the way we perform, and so much more. Can't wait for you to dive into this conversation. Now let's move on to the episode. I'm so excited to introduce our next guest, Dr. Daya Grant. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
I would love to hear about your story to becoming a mental performance consultant and what drove you to do what you do today.
We'll go way back, and because it all informs what I'm doing today. So I grew up in San Diego with my parents and my little brother, and my parents were perhaps ahead of their time in some ways, and they introduced us to meditation as kids. And as I grew up, I was really involved with ballet, eventually modern dance in high school. And my brother played basketball. So movement, athleticism was just a part of our childhood. And I really thought I wanted to be a professional dancer for a long time. Spent summers away at intensive programs. And finally, the last minute when I was supposed to, the night before sending in my Juilliard application, I had spent the summer there and I fell in love with it. And I thought, okay, this is it. This is my path. And I just had one of those epiphany moments that, wait a second, I don't think I want to actually be a professional dancer. Like, I want to keep dancing, but I'm kind of burnt out of the grind. And there's so much else I'm curious about. So gratefully, my parents are wonderfully supportive and they said, okay, let's pivot. So I went to Pomona College, studied neuroscience because I was fascinated with the brain, still was able to dance, and then graduated, wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with that neuroscience degree from a liberal arts school. So they kind of tell you, you can do whatever you want. And sometimes it's overwhelming and there are too many options. So I found myself going to work as a manager at Abercrombie and Fitch as kind of a gap year while I figured things out. Got my master's in sports psychology. And towards the end of that, there was a lot of conversation around concussions. And so I thought, this is fascinating. I miss neuroscience. I miss studying the brain at that level. So I took another little gap, was a manager at Lululemon while applying to grad school number 2. And then I got my Ph.D. in neuroscience from UCLA. And that informed next steps. I realized that I loved contributing to the science and to this question of what happens when adolescents get repeat concussions, what happens long term. And also, I wasn't the person that was going to be in the lab doing this research with proteins. It just was too micro for me. So I realized I needed to work with people again, and I missed being in environments where there were athletes and people pursuing their ambitious goals. So fast forward to 2018, and after working with a nonprofit for a few years, I decided, okay, I'm going to launch my private practice because I know what I want to do now, and there's no one else that's created a structure within which I can do that. So I'm just going to do it on my own. And that's gotten me to where I am. So I have my private practice now in sports psychology. I'm a mental performance consultant with athletes and high performers. And I get to combine the meditation, the yoga, the neuroscience, the sports psychology, all of that into my day-to-day work.
I find that story so fascinating. I love to hear that your parents introduced meditation to you and your brother at such a young age. And you've kind of taken that into and combining it with like something that's science-based that, we learn in a traditional classroom, and you combine it with something that's a little bit more from an Eastern philosophy, an Eastern practice. And so I love that combination. Can you kind of walk us through what your, I almost want to say methodology because we're talking about science and neuroscience, but that's not really it. Um, More of like your process, like how do you combine the two, neuroscience, meditation, and yoga into your practice and when you work with athletes?
So a lot of the integration happens on my own, sort of behind the scenes. So with all of the mental skills that I'm helping athletes develop, with all of the traditional sports psychology techniques that we use, I am fascinated by the neuroscience and the psychology underlying them. So I'll go back to the primary research and just dive into the data and look at, okay, what do we know about self-regulation, about parasympathetic nervous system activation, about managing from the top down our nervous system, and how can that inform the practices I use with athletes. So they may not know exactly why we're goal setting in this way, but I know that it's rooted in this body of research that I've studied. And if they're really curious about it, then yes, we'll touch on it. If they're super curious, we'll dive deeper. But it really informs the techniques that I use more than the conversations I have with athletes. Having said that, though, these are cerebral humans. Like every single athlete that comes to me thinks a lot, and they sometimes think too much, which is why they get in their own way when they're trying to perform. So they are naturally interested in what the brain does and the psychology around their efforts. So they may be really interested in it. So I don't shy away from sharing that knowledge, because sometimes it helps them gain a better understanding for why we're doing these things. Like I'm not just pulling things out of thin air and prescribing them. It's rooted in something.
Mhm.
And then in conjunction with the science, there's the ancient wisdom. And it's really cool to see how much neuroscience research has focused on meditation and this sort of yoga philosophy and more generally Eastern philosophy traditions. But it's still in its infancy. Like there's so much we don't know about these thousands of year old practices. So I love the science. I love to see where it's going. I follow it very closely. And also, I tell athletes, you've got to try this. Like, you have to experience this for yourself. I can tell you what the science says so far. There's a lot we don't yet know, So give it a shot. Try these breathing practices. Try meditating for 10 minutes before bed to relax, or try meditating for 10 minutes before you get out on the field and see what happens. Because that's really the data that is going to be more meaningful to them. It's really fun to integrate all of these. It's been a challenge in some ways for a long time. Neuroscience, yoga, sports psychology were all these parallel tracks in my life. And it took a while to figure out how to blend them. And now it feels really, really good. And luckily, I'm attracting the athletes that are also interested in the intersection of all of those fields.
Yeah, and working with athletes and also high performers in a certain way, very results focused and results oriented. So, as you mentioned, when they're trying some of the tools and the practices that you include in your sessions, they want to see results. And so, to that end, can you talk a little bit more about what a mental performance consultant is? So, what is it that people come to you for, and what is sort of like the thing that you're solving for them?
That's such a good question. Every athlete knows that their mind has something to do with how they perform. When I survey groups, if I'm giving a talk, I'll always ask at the beginning, what percentage of your performance has to do with what's going on in your mind? And depending on their age, if they're high school athletes, they tend to say 50%. If they're elite pros, they'll say upwards of 90% of my performance has to do with what's happening in my brain. So then the follow-up question is, okay, how much time are you devoting to training your brain? And it's never 90% of my training or even 50% of my training time is spent on the mind. So that opens up the conversation, and every athlete comes with something different. So some may struggle with focus. They know that when they're in practice, they want to get a quality practice out of it. They have limited reps, perhaps. For example, I'm working with a D1 quarterback right now, and he's one of 4 quarterbacks. And so there's limited time, there are limited opportunities in each practice session for him to actually get his hands on the ball and work with the receivers. So what does he do when his hands aren't on the ball? What can he do to train his mind when he's not on the field? So we talk about things like imagery, mental imagery, and goal setting, and where your focus needs to be, when it needs to be there, how to hone your focus, and then how to make sure there are times when you're spacing out because your brain needs that too, and that's important. Managing stress and pre-competition anxiety is a big one. So athletes may be able to show up pretty well in practice, and then when the pressure's on, things start to get a little bit trickier. So it's learning how to manage that, because the best of the best can be dealing with all sorts of things in their life, and then they get on the court, they get on the field, and they're just locked in and they show up. That doesn't happen by accident though. Like, they've trained that. So there are a bunch of different mental skills that we'll touch on. And to go back to that point about athletes want to see results, absolutely. So I'll start with things that I know are going to give them results in like the first session or the first week of us working together. And it may be just teaching them how to take a really good quality deep breath instead of rushing through every single set or every rep or every throw, every this or that. Just slowing things down, regaining control of their body, of their mind, and then the next throw, the next skill they have to execute is just going to come from a place of more control, and they see that immediately. So yeah, we've got to it's so important to meet them where they are, and I can talk about all of these tools that we can use and these skills we can develop, but if the fire that they need to put out right now is I'm crumbling under pressure, then that's what we address first.
Yeah. I love that so much. And I feel like what you just described is somewhat tied into some of past conversations I've had in previous episodes. And one of them that kind of came up for me is, how are you showing up every day So, we talked about the book Atomic Habits by James Clear, but in it, it's how do you do something consistently and just improve 1%? And so, how is consistency part of how you consult athletes and high performers? And, you mentioned breath work. With my own experience, I have adopted a daily yoga practice, which a lot of people don't realize yoga is not just asana. It's not just the poses. It's the breath work, pranayama, and meditation, which is what you do. And so you do all three, possibly more, because I know that there's 8 limbs, I believe,
Yes.
of
Yep.
yoga. So when you're working with athletes and high performers, and you mentioned breath work, a lot of people don't realize how powerful breath work and meditation can be and how it can impact like you optimizing your focus, optimizing your sharpness, your energy throughout the day, every day. So can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that part of how you work with athletes? Because I feel like that can apply to anyone that's listening as well.
Yes. Oh gosh, you mentioned so many good things in there. But the first is this idea of consistency. And I love that you mentioned James Clear because that 1% improvement is that's what compounds, as we know, over time. So that's what we're after. And you can't get there if you're not showing up. So I think maybe James Clear, perhaps the author Ryan Holiday talks about this a lot. Like if you want to be a writer, show up every day and write something, even if it's just 30 minutes. If you want to perfect something in the kitchen, cooking, show up every day for a few minutes and just kind of get your hands in there. So showing up is half the battle. Then I mean, for a lot of athletes, they're required to show up. If they have a coach, if they have a team, like that's built in. If you're an individual athlete or you don't have a coach, I'm a triathlete and I don't have anyone telling me, you've got to get out there for a run tomorrow or you've got to do this swim 3 days from now. I have to answer to myself. That can be harder. But the key is to show up. And then how are you going to show up? So we are not 100% every day. Nobody is. The best of the best are not at 100%. But one of the quotes I love is show up with whatever you have to give on that day. So if you're operating at 70%, if you're operating at 40% of your capacity, give 100% of that 70%, of that 40%. So that's a mindset shift that a lot of times we think it has to be all or nothing. It doesn't. Every day is a new opportunity to just be there and to practice and to experiment and explore. And we can't expect perfection or anyone anywhere near it every single day. So that's kind of the consistency piece. Getting good quality reps, having deliberate practices. This comes from yoga a lot, setting intentions before every single practice. I help athletes with this all the time because they may have an idea of what they need to get done in terms of the skills or the conditioning in their training session. But what's your mental intention? Are you going to focus on being present for the 2 hour workout? Are you going to focus on leadership and really being there for your teammates? Like, what is your intention? And being very clear and deliberate about that. These are all factors that contribute to consistency. What were the other parts of that amazing question you asked?
No, I think you've answered most of it in terms of the consistency part and how you're kind of integrating that as part of your teachings and how you consult and work with athletes. And I think that that can also apply to anyone that's listening, which are going to be the overachievers and the high achievers and the high performers. And you don't have to be a D1 athlete or a pro athlete to apply a lot of these principles. When you take the science behind neuroscience and something like meditation and breath work, what's the connection there? What's the science behind meditation and
Mm.
breath work?
There is an answer there.
Oh,
Yeah, there's
okay.
definitely an answer there. And there's also a direction. So we don't have necessarily clear it's always evolving, right? Science is constantly evolving. But we know so much more now than we did 20 years ago, which is very, very exciting. Meditation, even small, short durations of meditation, or yoga. A lot of the challenge with this research is that they conflate meditation with the asana practice. And so when we're looking at meta-analyses, like lots of papers, there isn't necessarily enough research out there to tease apart this type of meditation from this style of meditation with an asana practice, and then what type of asana practice, how long. So they clump all of it together, but there are some really exciting key findings. Two things: we know that meditation and yoga asana practice changes the structure and function of the brain in various areas. So again, even short bursts can change the patterning, like the networks in your brain, how different areas of the brain communicate with each other. This matters with things like dealing with emotions. So the amygdala is where a lot of our emotions are processed. When our amygdala is hyperactive, we are very emotional. A lot of our emotions are tied to memories. And what meditation allows us to do is it helps us create space between ourselves, and I'm going to say self with the capital S, like the essence of who we are, create space between that and our emotions, our thoughts, these transient things that just pass through us, but don't define us unless we let them. So it creates that space. And at the neural level, what we're doing is we're strengthening the connection between the amygdala, where your emotions are, and your prefrontal cortex. So this is the front of your brain, the part that is involved with execution and planning and logic. And this is the most recently developed part, evolutionarily speaking, of our brain. So many other animals in the animal kingdom don't have the developed prefrontal cortex that we have. And that's what makes humans so unique and capable of so much. So when we can strengthen the relationship between those two parts of the brain, we aren't controlled by our emotions because our prefrontal cortex is online. It's kind of the checks and the balances. It's saying, okay, I see that you're experiencing this, and this memory activated these emotions. I see that that's happening. Let's think through this. Let's sort through this. Let's process this. And then that obviously helps us move forward. So it's important that we feel our emotions and we acknowledge them. It's very important that we do that. I can't emphasize that enough. And also, we need the tools to be able to move through them, to allow them to move through us. And meditation is one of the most, in my opinion, the most powerful way to do that. And the science is backing that up. So that's changing of the networks. But there are also individual areas in the brain that grow over time as a result of consistent meditation practice. And it's really like, we're not just talking about the meditators in the caves in the Himalayas. Like, these are everyday people like you and me who can sit down for 15, 20 minutes each day. And over time, that is doing something very profound. That's enough for me to get on my meditation cushion, even if it's just for 5 minutes, because I know that something's happening at the neural level.
Yeah. Wow, thanks for breaking that down. And it was very clear that I'm going to kind of mirror back and let me know if I got this correct. The neuroscience is proving out that through meditation, it really connects the prefrontal cortex, which is almost like the masculine, put in quotes, side of the brain, with the amygdala, which is a little bit more the feminine because it's more emotional. And once those are connected and balanced, you're able to approach life in a way that your emotions isn't like running the show. There's also
Yes.
logic involved,
Yes.
so for the prefrontal cortex. And so as you were talking through this, in my head, I was thinking, wow, this is very therapeutic when you're talking about feeling your feelings, understanding your emotions, understanding what you're reacting to, why you're reacting to it. But the performance piece is the prefrontal cortex is, okay, we're going to acknowledge these feelings. What are we going to do about it? And how can we go about our day so that we're still performing at our highest? And that's sort of where you come in. You're not a therapist, even though
Right.
you understand the brain from a neuroscience perspective, you're taking this knowledge and helping others perform at their highest. Um,
Yes.
yeah. So did I?
Yes. That's exactly right. That's
Awesome.
exactly right.
I'd love
Cool.
to understand how you incorporate what are the 8 limbs of yoga and how you incorporate them. And then you also mentioned like the mental skills too. Because again, you combine all of these different approaches, the East and the West together to help others perform. So, yeah, can you, whichever one you want to start with and or how you want to integrate them?
Yeah, so that has been really fun for me to figure out. I had this body of knowledge with mental skills, and I had this knowledge as a yoga teacher and a meditation practitioner for so long of the 8 limbs. And I started to feel like there was something there that connected the two. And it really was my own curiosity that drove me to like really deep research into all of this. And essentially, the 8 limbs of yoga, these were really written down and defined by Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras. And they act as a framework or a guideline for any of us who are seeking higher levels of being. So we may call this bliss, we may call it enlightenment. When we say enlightenment, sometimes people are like, whoa, okay, well, no, I'm not trying, I'm just trying to get through my day. Like, I don't need to be enlightened. But really, I would argue that, yeah, but don't you want to experience a little bit more bliss, like blissful moments throughout your day? And for athletes, part of their why, whether they recognize it or not, is to experience that flow, be in the zone, to feel at one with their performance and what they're doing.
Mhm.
And I know personally that my blissful moments have more often than not occurred when I'm moving my body, when I'm in a race, or I'm just like out in nature on a hiking trail. That's how I've been able to connect to bliss. I looked at the 8 limbs of yoga and I realized there's so much synergy between them and the mental skills. And so the 8 limbs, we have guidelines for how we interact with the world around us, how we navigate our own internal processes. These are not, for those who may be less familiar, this isn't a chronological step-by-step approach. It's really think of it as limbs. Like you want all of them to kind of be in balance, and you need to exercise all of them um, in order to move closer towards the ultimate goal, which is self-actualization, self-realization, those blissful moments. We have to do the movement practice. Asana is part of the 8 limbs, do our meditation practice, do the breathing practices, and also start to withdraw our senses. And this is what a seated meditation enables us to do. So we spend so much time interacting with the world around us, but we don't spend as much time interacting with our inner landscape, like the world within us. And that's what I would argue is the next frontier. I love space exploration and learning all about what's happening in our universe. And also, there's so much knowledge that can be gained from going within. So we have to sit in stillness and turn our attention inward, and then start to focus our concentration, really concentrate, anchoring our breath and our mind. And then you can start to experience bliss and deep peace and joy and all of these qualities that we want. And I've incorporated that with the mental skills that I think are helping us do the same thing. So, for example, if we take santosha, which is contentment, it's part of the 8 limbs. It's something that we can generate from within. So I tell an athlete, I want you to practice santosha. I want you to practice contentment. And they're like, well, that's impossible because that's my goal over there, the championship, crossing that finish line. I'm not going to be content until I get there. And then I challenge them and say, can you tap into some contentment right now by maybe thinking back to an excellent practice you had or a race you had? Can you connect to that right now? And if so, that's you practicing contentment. And the irony is you have to be grounded and accepting and content with where you are in order to get to where you want to go faster. And it doesn't seem like that's how it works, but that is how it works. And so then there are mental skills and tools that I'll give them to help them tap into that contentment piece. And we do that with all of the limbs.
I love that. So you use the yogic philosophy, if that's the right term,
Yeah.
as the framework, and then
Yes.
the mental skills as a tool to tap into each of the 8 limbs. And
Yes.
as someone that works with athletes, because, we both know that with athletes, you think that it's always physical. Oh, we gotta build this muscle, we gotta recover the muscle, we come back stronger. And so there's a lot of training in the weight room, on the field, on the court, on the slopes, wherever it is. And that's great for the physical skills. But to your point, how much of their training is on the mental side? And how much, and mentally also includes how much rest, how much are they kind of withdrawing in order to come back strong or even stronger as well. So I love the approach that you're doing from a neuroscience perspective, combining a lot of the ancient wisdom from yoga and meditation. And you had mentioned earlier with meditation that not only does that specific practice help to really balance and connect the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, but also how it expands other parts of the brain. I'm curious if you can
Mhm.
go into that. That was a question that I had in my head that I forgot.
Yes, yes. That's a good question. Okay, so we'll take one structure, the hippocampus. That's where it's kind of the seahorse shaped structure in your brain where memories are processed. And as I mentioned, there's a strong tie between the hippocampus and the amygdala. And when both of those are really active, like we're now starting to feel really emotional about some memory, or the memory triggers these emotions, which can be a really wonderful thing. But when we're talking about performance, we want to keep that balanced, and we're going for equanimity here. So the hippocampus over time with consistent meditation, I'll say, actually shrinks in size. Now,
Hmm.
that doesn't mean that you're able to process your memories any less. It's that you're more efficient. So a lot of what we see with the brain changes in different areas of the brain is there is greater efficiency the more we've trained it. So even if you just look at the brain, there have been really cool studies looking at amateur athletes with professional athletes, and they'll do these seated brain scans where they analyze different parts of the brain, different structures. And when they're performing a task in their mind, so they're in the MRI machine, they're going through, let's say, a golf swing. The amateurs have activation in many regions in their brain because they're having to plan and they're having to read the green and they're having to pay attention to all these other factors, tell their body what to do. Whereas the pros, it's much more refined and natural now because of the practice. So there's less activation. And when you just look at the brain scans, you may at first think, gosh, well, the pros aren't thinking a lot, or there's not a lot happening there, but it's really an efficient process. So it's changed the mental skills, perhaps the meditation they've done has changed how the brain fires and communicates with each other, and the different regions communicate with each other differently than the amateurs.
Mhm.
So There's also, they've looked at total volume and cortical thickness, like all these different thickness tells us, okay, how many neurons are in this part of the brain? How many connections are there between the axons and how many synapses are there? Like that's all, we can measure that looking at things like cortical thickness. Um, and that increases over time when you're exercising your mind, when you're meditating. So you just have more real estate,
Hmm.
which is fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I can go on and on about this, but that's just kind of the introduction to how robust the brain is. And all of this goes back to neuroplasticity and the brain's ability to modify itself based on the inputs it's receiving and the environment and the conditions that it's in. And we
Yeah,
didn't know that that was possible 30, 40 years ago, that
really.
neuroplasticity was not accepted. And we thought, okay, the brain grows and develops, and by the time you hit 25, it's reached its peak, and then okay, it's all downhill from there. But now we're learning that the brain has the amazing capacity to restructure itself, but it listens to the inputs. So that's why we have
Got
to
it.
be cognizant of what we're feeding it.
That's interesting. So when we say the brain can kind of shift and change itself, is that mostly for like comprehension and or maybe I should say, is that more emotional or is it also cognitive, like cognitive abilities? Because there's
That
also like I think there's also this thought that by the time you hit 30-ish adulthood, um, your abilities, like your innateness is like kind of set. But what does
right,
neuroscience say about that?
right. So it says that you can change and your cognition can change. Now there is an aging process, right? So cognition overall, like if we're going to just say a blanket statement, it does decline with age, especially as you're, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. However, if you're intentional about it, and this is why when we're looking at neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, lifestyle is such a critical factor in the progression of that disease. And yes, there is a genetic component, but it's really the genetics accounts for something like 3% of Alzheimer's cases. The rest is lifestyle. So this is why you hear people talking about doing puzzles, doing Sudoku, getting outside and interacting with people in different environments, like really stimulating their brain because it can change. So it's possible, it's very possible to change cognitively and to improve cognitively.
Mm.
And it just takes effort. And you want to have the right tools, but
Yeah.
that's what this is about.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say it like kind of takes us full circle. What are some, I guess to kind of close it out before we share where to connect with you if anyone wants to work with you, but are there a few tips that you'd want to share that anyone can kind of apply with the work that you have, that they can, optimize and create more efficiency in their own day to day?
Oh my goodness, there's so many. Okay, so let's start with the one that people talk about a lot, and these are routines. We often hear about morning routines. And there's a reason that routines are so powerful. And every single athlete that I work with has built out a pre-performance routine and also a post-performance routine. So when you are getting ready to do anything, it can be being with your kids, it can be being a guest on a podcast or interviewing someone on a podcast. Maybe you're a public speaker, or you're an athlete. However you perform, whatever your arena is, you want to have a way to funnel your focus so that by the time you're ready to perform, you've eliminated distractions and you've primed your brain that, okay, this is what we're going to focus on. This is what we need to do right now. This is what's important. So that it can really show up for you. So that is the pre-performance routine. It needs to be simple. It can start for athletes. I start this the night before their performance. And then it extends all the way to minutes before. So whatever it is that you're doing, like think about it as an inverted triangle. And over time, you're narrowing your focus, right? So the bottom of the triangle, that point is just seconds before you perform when everything is dialed in and online. So think about things like, what do you need nutritionally? What are the types of things you want to be telling yourself? What does your self-talk look like as you're leading up to that performance? How do you need to move your body, prep your body? All the factors that contribute to your performance. And we all know some of the things that help us perform well. Sometimes we need a coach like myself to really help us with that process, but we can all start with some sense of what that looks like. And then have a routine for coming out of your performance. So transitions are really important. And I borrow this from yoga, right? Where we talk about on the mat from the asana practice, we talk about transitions and being intentional with how you transition. You, in your work, Casey, talk a lot about transitioning from one field to something completely different. So how do you transition out of your performance? What are the things that you need to do to extract meaning from what you just did, to learn from what you just did, and also let go of the stuff that's not going to serve you moving forward? You don't want to get stuck and ruminate. And we do this all the time. We perform in something and then we spend X number of hours, days thinking about what went wrong and what we should have done, and have a process for that. My late mentor, Ken Revisa, would really emphasize that when an athlete experiences disappointment, we as mental performance consultants have to let them experience that. That's tapping into their emotions, right? And also, we need to encourage them to set a deadline because at some point they have to move forward and they have to let that go so that they can prep themselves for what's to come. So that post-performance routine is really important to let go of what you don't need and to extract meaning so that you can show up at your next performance with some takeaways and also ready to perform. I have to add the breath like that. If you take nothing away from this conversation, start paying attention to your breath and implement breathing practices. It can be a single deep breath when you start to feel like your body is getting tense, that you're feeling stressed, that you're getting angry. Stop, take that deep inhale, let it go. And that in and of itself can just do wonders for all of us.
Mhm. Thank you for sharing both of those. Two things kind of popped up when you were sharing them. One, I recently saw this very short clip of the late Kobe Bryant in an interview when they were asking him about losing, a certain NBA championship. And he was like, yeah, I just moved on. They're like, oh, how does that, they were really trying to get at him. And he was very clear. He was just like, yeah, we lost. And then I moved on. And now we're moving on to the next one. So
Yeah.
I think that reflection, like feel it, but then move on. It seems so simple, but I think that also goes back to your brain work around the amygdala and what's kind of sitting there. And I don't think I'm using all the right terms, but all of the rewiring and stuff like that. But so that it's not just sitting there, it's, you're
Yes.
creating that efficiency to like, okay, we're going to, process it and then move on kind of thing.
Yes. Yes. And I know that you've read The Body Keeps the Score,
Yeah.
and our body holds on to stuff. Our brain holds on to stuff. Our tissues hold on to stuff. So be very mindful about how you're putting practices in place to not hold on to this stuff. And this goes for the disappointing losses, the devastating losses that someone like Kobe Bryant experienced. And he was just one of my heroes growing up. So I love that you mentioned him. But this also goes for the good stuff in life. And Kobe learned from Phil Jackson. And Phil Jackson's whole Zen philosophy was you've got to stay even. So when the good stuff happens and you win the championship games, feel it, experience it, and then get right back down to baseline and continue doing the work and putting in the practice. And when the stuff is really heavy and rocks you, feel that too, and then find your way back to baseline. So over time, you move through in this even keeled way. And that's really hard for us as humans to do. But if we can be mindful about that, then it helps us let go and move on and get back on our path.
Yeah. And I think to your point, going back to all of those memories and experiences live in your body and your mind and your tissues and your cells. If those aren't being released and processed and released in a consistent basis, it builds up so that when something does rock you, you can end up, falling off. There are other tools that you can use, if that happens. But just going back to that Phil Jackson Zen, I like that philosophy there. It helps you stay consistent regardless of if you're in, peaks or valleys. Thanks for sharing that. And then the second piece on the breath work, this has been a life-changing thing ever since I started. I'm studying to become a certified Ayurvedic advisor and hopefully continue the studies into a counselor. But I've been doing a consistent daily practice of breath work, meditation, and then asana. I fell off the wagon with asana for a little bit, but it's back on with those three.
Nice.
Even if you're doing pranayama, breath work, and meditation after, even if it's just 5 minutes meditation, I have seen some major differences. I mean, I'm combining with other things too, with like quality sleep and, other things that I'm doing, but it kind of goes back to this is sort of how on a daily basis I'm clearing stuff out
Yes.
and I'm connecting to my body in a deeper way. And then I physically feel that when I'm like going on a hike or something, I actually feel like even though I'm not at the gym every day and working out, I'm actually, when I'm out, my body's more connected. I have deeper
Yes.
breaths because of it. So yeah, even something like that can make a huge difference in your life. And I love to hear that, the meditation is that compounding effect. It is proven through science, through neuroscience. I'm so thankful that you have shared all this wisdom with us. I know that you work with a lot of athletes, but if you are open to working with people who are like athletic in a way, or they're athletes in their life, and they're high performers, and they want to connect with you, where can they find you?
Yes. And I love that you mentioned that. I use the term lifestyle athletes. So those of us that we love to move, however that looks. We don't necessarily compete in that. We don't necessarily have a coach in that, but we value movement. And even more than that, the people I love working with are those that are committed to elevating their own game, whatever that looks like for them, whatever that means for them. So they know that they can get more out of themselves and out of their life, and they are ready for some guidance there. That is what lights me up. So it doesn't matter what your performance arena is. Yes, I love working with athletes. I love working with lifestyle athletes, and I just love working with committed, ambitious, open humans. So my website is a great place to start, diagrant.com. And I'm also very active on Instagram, and I love meeting new people there and engaging authentically. So you can see me in both those places. You can sign up. I have a weekly newsletter on the mental game, and I include mental strength tips and just upcoming events that am involved with, courses that I have. So you can sign up for that. And I'm just so excited to have had this opportunity and grateful to you, Casey, for bringing me on to speak with your wonderful, wonderful listeners who I know are just rearing to get even more out of life. And that's exciting.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Daya. I'll include those links in the show notes. And thank you again for coming on.
Thank you so, so much.
I am so grateful to have had this fascinating conversation with my friend, Dr. Daya Grant. She dropped so much knowledge and translated how we can apply these principles as everyday high-performing individuals or lifestyle athletes. In this conversation, we discuss the true science behind some of the buzzwords we are hearing a lot lately, like self-regulation and managing our nervous system. I learned so much and hope you did too. Mental performance has so much to do around narrowing our focus, setting our intentions, identifying and keeping our emotional baseline, releasing what our bodies are holding on to, the ability to balance our emotions with our actions, expanding our brain, being present and content with our joy and bliss, and ensuring we are training our mental body just as much as our physical body. We can do this through so many tools, including the Eastern philosophies around breathwork, meditation, and yoga, combined with mental strength exercises. So I'm curious how you are training your mental body, or what tools or theories did we discuss that resonate with you? Share this episode and tag me or send me a note on Instagram. The link is in the show notes. Once again, this is Casey Cunless, host of the Hello Flow Pod, signing off until next week. Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. If there's anything that resonated with you, please share it on Instagram and tag me at CaseyCan_ and at HelloFlow Collective. I would love to hear from you. As always, if you enjoy listening to what we discuss on the podcast, please share the show with friends who may also resonate. And don't forget to also subscribe, rate, and review. See you next time on the Hello Flow podcast.